The judge's voice cracked like a rifle shot across that courtroom. "Take it off." 3 words. 40 years of service meant nothing to him. I stood there in my dress uniform. My Navy Cross caught the fluorescent light, and I felt every eye in that room land on my chest, like a verdict already decided. My sister-in-law was smiling. She thought she'd already won. She had no idea what was sitting inside my briefcase, and neither did the man in the black robe, who was about to destroy his own career without even realizing it. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I've worn this uniform for 18 years. I've bled for it. I've buried friends who wore the same one. And on a gray Tuesday morning, in a county courthouse that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, I found myself standing trial. Not for anything I'd done wrong, but because a woman I once called family decided my honor was something she could put a price tag on. I want to tell you how I got there, because it didn't happen overnight. Nothing like this ever does. Part 1. The family. I joined the Army at 22, right out of college. My father used to joke I had more stubbornness than sense. He wasn't wrong. I served 2 decades, most of it overseas, chasing missions I still can't talk about at dinner parties. I was wounded once, badly enough that I spent 4 months relearning how to walk without wincing. And somewhere in the middle of all that, during a joint operation with a Marine unit I still think about at 3 in the morning, I earned something called the Navy Cross. It's not a medal soldiers talk about. It's one you carry quietly. The people who understand what it costs don't need you to explain it, and the people who don't understand never will. I never wore it to family dinners, never brought it up at church picnics. When neighbors asked what I did for a living, I said, "I'm in the Army," and left it at that. My mother used to tell people her daughter was a hero, and I'd change the subject so fast you'd think she'd insulted me. That's just who I am. Quiet, steady. I don't need applause to know what I did was real. My sister-in-law Melissa was cut from different cloth entirely. She married my brother David 12 years ago. From the very first Thanksgiving, I could feel her sizing up our family like a woman doing inventory: the china cabinet, my mother's wedding ring, the deed to the old house. Like she was calculating their resale value in her head. David loved her. God knows I tried to see what he saw. But love doesn't erase the way somebody treats a waitress, or the way they talk about people the second they leave the room. When my parents passed, my father first, from a heart that gave out slowly over years, my mother 18 months later, from a grief I don't think she ever intended to survive. They left the family house to David and me, equally. Nothing extravagant. White clapboard, a wraparound porch, an oak tree in the backyard my father planted the year I was born. It wasn't about the money. It was the last piece of them we had left. Melissa didn't see it that way. She saw square footage. She saw a listing price. Sell the house, split the cash. Let's use it for the kids' college fund. Let's use it for anything except letting it sit there gathering dust. David resisted for a while. But Melissa has a way of wearing people down. She doesn't yell. She just repeats herself, softer and softer, until you agree just to make the noise stop. I refused to sell. I wanted to keep it in the family, fix it up, let his kids spend summers there the way we used to. David seemed to understand. Melissa did not. Months went by. Phone calls got shorter. Holidays got tense. Then one afternoon in early spring, a man in a windbreaker showed up at my front door. He wouldn't quite meet my eyes. He handed me legal papers. Melissa was suing me. On paper, it was about misappropriation of shared property. Fancy words for something much simpler. She wanted to force a sale. And when I wouldn't budge, she decided the courtroom was where she'd get her way. I remember standing on my porch that day, papers in hand, feeling something I hadn't felt since my last deployment. Not fear exactly. More like the cold, clarifying calm that comes right before you have to do something difficult. David called that night. Apologetic, torn, caught in a war he never wanted. I told him I understood. I wasn't angry at him, but I wasn't going to fold just because someone decided my patience was a weakness to exploit. Part 2. The courtroom. So there I was, weeks later, walking into that courtroom in my dress uniform. Not for show, not for sympathy. I'd just come from a veterans memorial service that morning and hadn't had time to change. My Navy Cross was pinned exactly where regulations said it should be. I sat at the defendant's table, straightened my jacket, and glanced once at Melissa, already whispering to her lawyer. A smile stretched a little too wide across her face. I had no idea how strange this day was about to get. The judge, a heavy-set man named Richard Harland, ran his courtroom like a personal kingdom. He banged his gavel to bring the room to order, looked over the paperwork, glanced up at me once, and something in his expression shifted. Something sharp, almost offended. He leaned forward, tapped his pen against the bench, and said the words that would change everything. "This is not a place to show off war trophies." I'd heard about Judge Harland before I ever set foot in that courtroom. Lawyers in that county talked about him the way you'd talk about weather you couldn't control. You just braced yourself and hoped to get through the day. He had a reputation for cutting people off mid-sentence, for making examples out of anyone who looked too comfortable in his courtroom. And apparently, somewhere along the way, he'd developed a particular disdain for what he called military theater, people who used their service like a costume to win sympathy. I didn't know that yet. I only knew a man in a black robe had just accused me, in front of a packed courtroom, of showing off. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," I said, keeping my voice level. 18 years of training does that to you. It doesn't matter how fast your heart is pounding, your voice learns to stay flat, controlled, unreadable. "This uniform isn't a costume. I came from a memorial service this morning." He didn't even look up. "Take off the medal." The room went quiet. That particular quiet a room gets when everyone realizes they're watching something they shouldn't be. I could hear the air conditioning humming overhead. A chair creaked in the gallery. My attorney, a sharp young man named Foster, started to rise, mouth already forming an objection. I put my hand on his arm and shook my head. "Not yet." "Is that an official order of this court?" I asked. Harlan's eyes flicked up to mine for the first time. I recognized it instantly, the particular irritation of a man who isn't used to being questioned. "Yes," he said, drawing it out like he was doing me a favor. "It is." Beside me, Melissa exhaled a soft, satisfied breath. She leaned toward her lawyer and whispered something I couldn't catch. I didn't need to hear the words to understand the tone. Gloating. She thought this was the beginning of my unraveling. She thought a man in a robe telling me to strip a piece of my identity off my chest was going to break something in me. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Somewhere behind me, a low murmur rippled through the gallery. Two older men sat stiff-backed in the third row, the kind of posture you only get from years of formation drills. One of them, silver-haired, in a faded ball cap, stared at my chest, his expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief. He recognized it. I saw it happen in real time. His jaw tightened, and he leaned over and murmured something to the man beside him. Neither said a word out loud. Nobody ever does in a courtroom. The silence is its own kind of law, heavier than anything written in a statute book. My father used to tell me the loudest rooms were rarely where the real decisions got made. The real decisions happened in the quiet ones, in the pauses between words, in the choices people made when they thought no one important was watching. This felt like one of those quiet rooms, and I intended to make my decision count. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, almost gentle. "Before I comply, I'd like the record to reflect the nature of this request." Harlan's jaw tightened, the way a man's does when he senses he's being handled but can't quite say how. "Ms. Brooks, this isn't a debate." "Major Brooks," I corrected quietly, not sharply, just a fact, laid on the table like a card. "And I understand it isn't a debate. I only want the transcript to be accurate." Something flickered across his face. Irritation. Yes. But underneath it, something else. A flicker of uncertainty, like a man realizing the floor beneath him wasn't as solid as he'd assumed. He recovered quickly, straightening his robe. "Proceed with whatever you need to proceed with," he said. but the metal comes off before we continue. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I reached down, unclasped my briefcase, and set it on the table with a quiet, deliberate click that seemed to echo louder than it should have. Melissa's smile faltered. Part 3. The documents. The briefcase had traveled with me through 3 duty stations. Leather worn soft at the corners, a small nick near the handle. Inside, tucked in a blue folder I'd prepared weeks earlier, not out of paranoia, but out of the same discipline that had kept me alive in places most people only see on the news, was everything I needed. I didn't say much. Words tend to lose their weight when you throw too many of them around. I've learned to let documents speak when documents can speak better than I can. Permission to approach, Your Honor. He nodded, almost impatiently. I walked the folder up myself instead of routing it through the clerk. I wanted him to have to open it, to have to touch it. He flipped it open with the practiced disinterest of a judge who's seen 10,000 exhibits and expects the 10,001st to be just as forgettable. Page 1. A formal citation confirming the Navy Cross, complete with the operational details cleared for release, signed by officers whose names carried weight in rooms far more serious than this one. His hand, resting on the edge of the bench, went still. Page 2. A Department of Defense verification record, the kind of document that exists specifically to settle disputes about military honors. Because apparently, there are enough people willing to lie about their service that the government keeps official channels just to shut those lies down. Mine wasn't a lie. Mine had a case number, a verification stamp, a chain of signatures going back years. Page 3. A formal legal opinion from the Office of the General Counsel, addressing something most civilians never think about: the protections surrounding the wearing of duly awarded military decorations during official proceedings. Not a suggestion, not a courtesy. Federal guidance, spelling out exactly what judicial officers were expected to understand before making a demand like the one Harland had just made. The color in his face shifted. Subtle at first, like a man realizing the ground under his feet had a crack in it he hadn't noticed. "This changes nothing," he said. But his voice had lost its certainty. I kept my tone even. "Your Honor, I'd ask that you read the final page." He hesitated, just for a second, but I saw it, the flicker of a man realizing he was standing somewhere he hadn't meant to stand. He turned the page. I already knew what it said. I'd written the accompanying letter myself, weeks before, when I first suspected this case wouldn't stay a simple property dispute. Melissa wasn't the type to let things go quietly, and I'd learned a long time ago: the best way to survive an ambush is to know it's coming before the first shot is fired. His jaw worked slightly, the muscle beneath his cheek tightening, releasing. A flush climbed up from his collar. Not embarrassment, exactly. Closer to the color of a man realizing he'd made a mistake in front of witnesses, in front of a court reporter, in front of a room full of people who would remember exactly what he'd said and how. "Where did you get this?" he asked. For the first time all morning, his voice didn't carry the weight of command. It carried something closer to concern. "I've had legal counsel for some time, Your Honor," I said simply. I anticipated this might become more complicated than a property dispute. The final page was a memorandum, one most people outside legal and military circles never encounter, distributed to federal and state courts. It laid out, in plain language, that judicial officials must handle properly worn military decorations with respect during proceedings, and that any request to remove them must be grounded in clear legal necessity, not personal discretion. No ambiguity, no room for a judge to claim he simply hadn't known better. His lips moved slightly on the second read-through, the way people do when they're not just reading anymore. They're calculating, running numbers, trying to figure out how bad this actually was. Foster cleared his throat beside me. "Your Honor, given the sensitivity of this matter, I'd like to formally request the court's remarks from this morning be preserved verbatim in the official transcript." "That's already standard procedure, Counselor," Harlan snapped. "Just wanted it on the record, Your Honor," Foster said. I caught the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't gloating, too professional for that. But there was something satisfying in watching a man who'd spent the morning throwing his weight around suddenly realize the floor was made of glass. The court clerk spoke up from her desk. "For the record, Your Honor, today's proceedings are being recorded per standard courtroom policy." I don't think Harland had forgotten that. I think, in the rush of his own irritation, he simply hadn't thought through what it meant. Every dismissive comment about war trophies, every clipped demand, captured, preserved, time-stamped, available, if it ever needed to be, to people whose job it was to review exactly this kind of conduct. It wasn't panic behind his eyes. Men like Harland don't panic easily. They've spent too many years mistaking control for invincibility. But it was the beginning of something close to it. The dawning, uncomfortable awareness that he'd walked into a moment he couldn't talk his way back out of. Beside me, Melissa had gone very still. "Your Honor," I said, tone measured, almost gentle. "I understand the court has a great deal of discretion in how it manages proceedings. I've never questioned that. I only wanted to make sure any request made of me today was made with full information." He didn't respond right away. He set the folder down, folded his hands on top of it, and took a long breath, the kind of breath men take when they're buying themselves a few seconds to think. "Let's move forward," he finally said, quieter than before. "We'll revisit procedural matters later." It wasn't an apology. I hadn't expected one. Men like Harland don't apologize in front of an audience. The most you can hope for, in the moment, is a retreat. And this was exactly that. Part 4. The Witness. I sat back down. Foster leaned over. "That went well." "It's not over," I murmured back. Because it wasn't. Melissa's lawsuit was still sitting on the table, unresolved. And beneath everything that had just happened was the real reason I was there. An inheritance. A house my parents left us. A sister-in-law who'd decided greed was worth destroying a family over. The medal, the memorandum, the judge's misstep, none of that erased the actual claim against me. It had simply exposed something rotten in how the morning began. I looked at Melissa, now whispering fiercely to her attorney, her earlier composure cracking at the edges. Whatever confidence she'd walked in with had thinned considerably in the last 20 minutes. I leaned toward Foster. "I think it's time to call the witness." He nodded, gathering his papers. I stood, smoothing the front of my jacket, feeling the weight of the Navy Cross still resting exactly where it belonged. "Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the courtroom. "I have one more witness to call." The courtroom doors opened with a heavy, deliberate sound, the kind that makes people turn in their seats before they even know why. I didn't have to turn. I already knew who was walking in. I'd called him 3 weeks earlier, sitting alone in my kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, explaining as calmly as I could that I needed him. That this was bigger than a house, bigger than Melissa's greed. Colonel Michael Sanders had been my commanding officer during the deployment that earned me the Navy Cross. Retired now, silver-haired, still carrying himself with the kind of posture that makes civilians instinctively straighten up when he walks past. I hadn't seen him in almost 2 years, not since a reunion dinner where we'd spent most of the night not talking about the mission at all, because some things you carry together in silence rather than words. He walked down the center aisle in a suit instead of a uniform. Didn't matter. Everyone could tell this was a man who'd spent his life giving orders and having them followed without question. Harland's expression shifted the moment Sanders took the stand. I don't think he recognized him, but he felt something, a presence, a gravity that filled the room differently. Foster walked him through his credentials. 31 years of service, 2 combat deployments as a young officer, years commanding units overseas, including the joint operation where he'd served as my direct commanding officer. "Colonel Sanders," Foster asked, "can you confirm Major Brooks's account of the events that led to her receiving the Navy Cross?" "I can," Sanders said. "I was there. I submitted the recommendation myself." He described it plainly, without embellishment. None of the swelling music you hear in movies, just facts, laid out one after another, each one heavier than the last. The operation. The moment things went wrong. A decision I'd made under fire that had saved lives that weren't supposed to make it out of that situation. I sat very still while he spoke. It's easier to hear that story in someone else's voice than to carry the weight of telling it myself. Then Sanders said something I hadn't planned for. I should also mention, he said, turning toward the bench, that I spent the last several years of my career training judicial and legal personnel in military protocol, including proper courtroom conduct regarding uniforms and decorations. It's part of a continuing education program many jurisdictions require. The room went very quiet. Sanders looked directly at Harland, not aggressively, just with the plain, unblinking directness of a man who spent his life dealing with people who think their authority excuses them from doing their homework. You should have known this, he said. It's not obscure information. It's basic training material. Harland's face went through several colors in about 4 seconds. Melissa's attorney rose abruptly. Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess. Denied, Harland said, a little too quickly, a little too sharply, the kind of response that comes from a man trying to reclaim control he already knows he's lost. It was, I'd later realize, exactly the wrong move. A recess would have let everyone breathe, reset, let the temperature drop. Instead, he just made it clear he wanted this over as fast as possible. In a room full of people already watching him carefully, that urgency read as exactly what it was. Melissa was pale now, her earlier bravado nowhere to be found. Part 5. The Complaint. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. Foster looked at me, a question in his eyes. I gave him a small nod, the kind you give someone right before you commit to something you can't take back. Your Honor, I said, calm, steady, carrying easily across the silence. Before we continue, there's something I need the court to be aware of. I set the phone on the table, screen facing up. I hadn't planned to use it that morning. I'd hoped I wouldn't need to. But somewhere between the judge's first careless demand and Colonel Sanders's testimony, I'd watched a pattern unfold that told me exactly what kind of man I was dealing with. Someone who mistook his robe for immunity, who assumed his word was the only law that mattered within those walls. Men like that don't stop on their own. They stop when something bigger than their own certainty finally catches up to them. Foster connected my phone to the courtroom's display screen. A small, almost comically ordinary technical delay in a moment that felt anything but ordinary. Nobody spoke while we waited. Then the screen flickered to life. A confirmation notice, time-stamped, official, showing a formal complaint had been submitted minutes before proceedings began that morning. Not out of malice, not as a trap. I want to be honest about that, because it matters. I hadn't known exactly how the morning would unfold. I'd only sensed, from the tone of the pre-trial filings, that something about this case felt engineered to be more theatrical than it needed to be. And when you sense a fight coming, you prepare before it arrives, not after. The complaint wasn't filed to punish anyone in advance. It was filed to protect the integrity of the process. The same way every serious military operation I'd ever been part of required oversight, documentation, accountability. Not revenge. Making sure the people entrusted with authority actually earned the right to keep it. The recipient sat on the screen in plain black text. The Judicial Oversight Committee. The state's Judicial Ethics Investigator. The Regional Veterans Affairs Liaison Office. Already in motion. Before the first word had even been spoken that morning. Harland's breath caught. Small sound. But in a silent room, small sounds carry. Everything said here today, I explained, has already been recorded through the court's own system, as confirmed by the clerk. That recording, along with today's transcript, will be part of the review process. He didn't say anything. He stared at the screen, and something settled over his face. I'd seen it before, in soldiers who'd just realized the terrain they were standing on wasn't the terrain they thought it was. A particular kind of stillness. Not fear exactly. More like the sudden, sinking understanding that the outcome of the next several months was no longer entirely in your hands. An independent review process, once triggered, doesn't go away because the person under review apologizes or backpedals. It runs its course. It examines everything, not just this morning's conduct, but potentially other cases, other complaints, other patterns sitting quietly in a file somewhere, waiting for someone prepared enough to bring them into the light. Melissa had stopped whispering to her lawyer entirely. Hands pressed flat against the table, eyes darting between the screen and the judge, as though only now beginning to understand this morning had never really been about her lawsuit at all. Her eyes welled up. She fought it, blinking hard, jaw tight. I felt something for her in that moment. Not sympathy exactly, more like a distant, complicated recognition that greed rarely starts out as greed. It starts as fear, or resentment, or a belief that you deserve more than what you've been given. And somewhere along the way, it curdles into something uglier. I didn't say any of that out loud. It wasn't the moment. Harlan set down his gavel very slowly, like a man setting down something fragile. "The court," he said, and for the first time all morning his voice carried none of its earlier weight, "will take a recess." He stood. The bailiff moved to escort him from the bench, though no one had asked for assistance. The room stayed silent for a long moment after he disappeared through the side door, as though everyone needed permission to breathe again. Part 6. What the Dust Left Behind. 3 months passed before the Judicial Oversight Committee released its findings. Life kept moving, whether I was ready or not. I went back to work. I attended a funeral for a fellow veteran, stood at attention in a cemetery under a gray sky, and thought about how honor sometimes gets tested in places you'd never expect, not just on a battlefield, but in a courtroom on an ordinary Tuesday morning. When the results came, they arrived as a formal letter, plain, understated, the kind of document that carries enormous weight despite its unremarkable appearance. Judge Richard Harland had been formally disciplined and ultimately removed from the bench, not for one careless remark about a medal. The investigation had examined his conduct patterns over several years, and my case, it turned out, had simply been the thread that unraveled the rest. I felt no satisfaction reading it, only a quiet, settled sense that something had been corrected that needed correcting. Melissa's lawsuit collapsed not long after. The judge assigned to the reopened proceedings found the claims baseless, built on frustration and a desire for a payout that was never legally hers. The court ordered her to reimburse my legal costs, calling it a meritless filing pursued in bad faith. I remember reading that phrase, bad faith, and thinking about how rarely the law finds language sharp enough to describe what greed actually looks like up close. David came to see me on a Sunday afternoon, a few weeks after the ruling. Sat across from me at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he never drank. He apologized, not just for the lawsuit, but for years of not paying closer attention, for letting Melissa's resentment simmer without ever asking where it came from. I told him what I'd learned a long time ago in the Army. You can't always stop someone from making a mistake, but you can decide how you respond when the dust settles. He nodded, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had my brother back. Melissa left, not just the marriage, though that came too. Quietly, eventually, without the drama I think she once imagined she was capable of creating. She left the family altogether. I don't know where she is now. Sometimes I wonder if she thinks about that morning, about the moment the ground shifted under everyone's feet, including her own. I hope, wherever she is, she's found something better to build her life around than resentment. I mean that honestly. Bitterness is a heavy thing to carry, and I've never wished that weight on anyone, not even her. Closing. As for me, I didn't celebrate. No party, no toast raised in victory. The day the results came through, I drove out to the old house, the one my parents left us, the one this entire ordeal had technically been about, though by the end, it had become about something so much larger than square footage and property lines. I walked through the rooms slowly, running my hand along the same banister I used to slide down as a kid. Stood for a long moment under the oak tree my father planted the year I was born, tall enough now to shade half the backyard. I took my Navy Cross out of the small wooden box where I usually kept it. Not because I was ashamed of it, I've just never needed to see it every day to remember what it meant. I held it in my palm, thinking about the young woman I'd been the day I earned it, and the older woman I'd become since. How strange that the same medal that once nearly cost me everything in a courtroom had ultimately been the thing that saved me. I don't need anyone else's permission to know what I did was real. I never did. Honor was never about being recognized. It's about not betraying it, even in the moments when no one else is watching. Even when the person questioning you sits above you in a black robe with a gavel and thinks that gives them the final word. It doesn't. It never has. I stepped onto the front porch that evening as the sun dipped behind the trees, the American flag my father used to fly still hanging from its post, moving gently in the breeze. Some people believe power gives them the right to insult another person's dignity. But in a country built on the rule of law, power only survives when it walks hand in hand with responsibility. The day that Judge ordered me to remove my Navy Cross, he thought he was putting me on trial. In the end, it was his own career standing before the bench. If this story moved you even a little, I'd love to hear where it landed with you. Drop a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from tonight. It means more than you'd think. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting to be told. If you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and subscribe. Let's keep this journey going.